Hello and welcome to the Alternative Car Show, and this is very personal for me because the car behind me is the Panther Solo 2, and through fate, a bit of good fortune, I was there in the development team when that car was being developed. So I'm going to tell you the whole story from the beginning that has never been told on camera before. Into a ditch, flipped over. Chassis 004 was the candy floss car, otherwise known by the production staff as the Pimpmobile. The original Panther Solo, the Solo 1, was designed again by Ken Greenlee, and the chassis was done by none other than Len Bailey. Now, Len Bailey designed the chassis for the Ford GT40 and the Lola that preceded it. So you could say it had some pedigree. The engine was the Ford CVH 1.6 from the Ford Escort, mounted transversely using the Ford Escort gearbox. But as you can see, being a specialist manufacturer's car, it was quite space-aged. Definitely visually a challenge for the MR2 that scared young C. Kim so much that he cancelled this car. But many people within Panther, and many people I've spoken to since, think that this, the Panther Solo 1, could and should have gone into production and would have come in at a lower price point than the Panther Solo 2, and the two of them could possibly have sat side by side as a range. But it was a missed opportunity and a car that never was. And I suppose we can all look back and wonder, what if? In 1987, the world of motoring was astonished by the fact that young C. Kim of Panther Cars, who had bought the company from Robert Yankel, who'd created the company in 1972, had scrapped the Solo 1. That was a mid-engined 1.6 litre Ford Escort based two-seater in the MR2 mould, and it was because young C. Kim had driven a prototype MR2 over in Japan that he realised that dynamically the Solo 1 wouldn't necessarily have coped by comparison. What he failed to realise is that the Solo 1 was a low volume production car, and therefore it would have found a market big enough to satisfy the production needs of a company like Panther. But anyway, he decided to scrap it, and in 1987 a new version came out which looked nothing like the original, and that is the car behind me, the Solo 2. Instead of having the 1.6 Escort engine, it had the 2-litre turbo from the Cosworth, the 4-wheel drive running gear from the XR 4x4, all mounted with the engine mounted midships, and all with a Kevlar and honeycomb aluminium centre section on a backbone chassis with steel subframes front and rear. That first car was 001, chassis number 001. It was little more than a mock-up. It had little winglets on the end of the wings at the back. It was a little squarer than the production car that's behind me, and it never drove over 30 miles an hour. All the journalists that drove it never went over 30 miles an hour. And the company announced that the car would be in production the following year for £28,000. It was completely unrealistic, but the public had been told, the press had been told, and customer deposits were taken. The seed was sown for what was to follow. Around this time, young C. Kim and the parent company owned by his father that owned Panther sold the company to SSangYong. Now, SSangYong were one of the fifth biggest conglomerate in Korea, South Korea. They had assets in shipbuilding, they had car production, they had truck production. So with Panther, they had the Callista already in production and the brand new Solo, which was under development. They'd get a supercar as well as a sports car. The Callista's body was already being manufactured and shipped over to the UK as a body chassis unit. And the company in return was theoretically getting the investment needed to get this supercar into production. At least that's what we thought. I mean, SSangYong had the money to invest properly in the development of the Solo. If it had been done properly with their resources, this car could have been put into production with a big team behind it, and it could have become the Lotus Esprit rival that it was always threatening to be. However, that wasn't what was going to happen. Len Bailey by now had long since gone. Having designed the chassis for the Solo 1, he was probably more than a little bit upset that the whole project had been cancelled at very short notice. Ken Greenley, who designed the car, however, had been asked to design the Solo 2, and was now made head of design for Panther Cars, with a non-executive directorship of the company. Not quite sure how that worked in terms of status within the company, but he definitely oversaw design, and we definitely had visits from him on a regular basis to check on progress of the car. In fact, we saw a lot more of Ken Greenley than we ever saw of the managing director or, well, pretty much most of the people in the offices. Now, my personal involvement started way back in 1987 when the company still had the facilities at Byfleet within the old Brooklands race circuit. Now, what happened was that although there was 11 other guys taken on at the same time as me, they were sent up to Harlow to the new factory, and as far as I know, they spent a lot of time sweeping up and painting the floors, whilst me and I think 2 other guys were down at Byfleet being shown how the Callista went together so that we could go to Harlow and sort of speed up the productionization of the Callista in Harlow. The problem was that I was 17. I didn't know one end of a spanner from the other. I was, by my own admittance, pretty useless, and therefore what I took in wasn't necessarily as much as someone who was a lot more experienced. But I was there, it was my first job, I'd travelled away from home, and it was very, very helpful to me to see the old Brooklands site and meet some of the guys that worked there. And one of them, the guy that trained me, said one thing that has stayed with me. We are the guys on the production line. We are the ones that earn the money. The guys that design the cars, the guys that sell the cars, they're very good at spending money, but we're the ones that earn the crust. At Byfleet, the production line for the Callista involved, from what I can remember, something like 80 guys in total. Whereas when I got to Harlow, the production line had about 28 guys in total assembling cars, and the rest of the whole unit was taken up by engineers, prototype teams, sales department, officers, management, accountants, and of the 150 to 200 employees whilst I was there, only about no more than 50 at any one time were producing cars. Again, I think there's a portent for what was to follow. But why was the move from Byfleet to Harlow? Well, Byfleet, they rented the premises, and there was a lot of pressure from developers who wanted to use that part of the circuit to build what is now a retail park. The problem was that the company would have had to relocate within Byfleet. The rent would have been high. There was no guarantee that there wasn't going to be further encroachment, but they had the skill set there and they had the workers there that had built the cars for years, right back to 1972 in some cases. However, the decision was made to move production to Harlow in Essex, and I was one of the first people who was taken on to work on the production line. With no experience, I could be trained up and basically taught how to do it the way they wanted it doing. So the reason for the move was understandable. The distance to Harlow, well, Mike Newman, the new managing director, came from Essex. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but that was the rumour at the time. Chassis number 1 was the original mock-up. What should have happened at that point was the whole car frozen. Proper production molds taken, panels modified, working out where the panel gaps were, how everything was going to go together, and then production panels made. What happened, because of that 1 year promise, plus all the inconvenience and hassle of moving from one county to another county, losing most of your skilled workforce and having to train up new ones, having to recruit people because the old workforce didn't want to move or didn't get asked to move in some cases, you ended up with a situation where instead of developing the car properly and starting again, they developed from basically splitting panels that had gone before. It was evolution upon evolution upon evolution from that stage onwards. After about a year, chassis number 2 was built. This one broke my heart because we put a full interior with the specialist paint that was sprayed onto all the panels. Now this was like a soft touch, springy, it was a matte finish, and it was like a springy soft touch paint. And that was sprayed on all the interior. Lead weights were put in to simulate some of the other additions that would go into the car. And the car was fully trimmed out. Everything was fitted. The seats were fitted. The carpets were in. And then they crashed it into a wall at 30 miles an hour. Now, chassis 002 could never be used again because one of the rules with type approval is your crash test car is your crash test car, and that is it. But one thing came out of that. The structure was incredibly strong. It had a Kevlar centre section on a backbone chassis with steel subframes front and rear. That Kevlar centre section with the honeycomb strengthening was so rigid that with the chassis beneath it and the steel addition to the Kevlar components, the steering column moved by 2 millimeters, the lowest number of any car that was tested by Mara at that time. Chassis 003, now this was the proper test mule. This had the full set of running gear. Now, the important thing about chassis number 3 was it was the first one to get the production centre diff. Now, if you're wondering why the Cosworth Sierra never came out with the 4-wheel drive from the XR 4x4 when it was first launched, that is because the centre differential would explode under the torque from the Cosworth engine. When Panther asked Ford if they could use the 4-wheel drive running gear, they said, sure, but it won't take the power of the Cosworth. In fact, in the rally cars, if you listen to the Jim McRae interview that I did, which you will also find on this YouTube channel, he said that the rear diff couldn't take up the tuned torque from the rally cars unless they were rebuilt after every few stages. But when it came to the 4-wheel drive system in the Solo, Panther cars spent the money to have the centre diff re-engineered so that it could take the torque of the Cosworth engine. And Ford said, thank you very much, and they brought out the Cosworth 4x4. There's a little one for you. The Panther engineers were not exactly chuffed at that because Panther, a little company, had spent all that money to get that done. And here they were with Ford basically taking that hard work. But 003, chassis number 003, had that new centre diff, the full four-wheel drive setup with the Cosworth engine and the turbo, 204 brake horsepower, and that did all the road test mileage, the track mileage, the longevity mileage, and it actually was ultimately the most reliable Panther Solo ever, because it had the most miles and the most development spent on it. But because of its use on all the prototype work, it was decided that it was just a little bit too rough for anyone to see. Later on in its life, towards the end of development, when the prototypes were reaching number 5 and number 6, 003 was re-engineered as a two-wheel drive car with a mid-engined Rover V8. Everyone gushed about how that car sounded, how it went, and the handling of the two-wheel drive setup. But it was never to be. Chassis 004 was the candy floss car, otherwise known by the production staff as the Pimpmobile. You see, in the factory, Ken Greenley was the designer of the car, and he had a protege, and the protege was the in-house designer, and they let him loose on the candy floss car. He got to choose the colours, and so you ended up with a show car with metallic candy floss paintwork. The interior was semi-aniline, which scratched if you looked at it. And you had the carpet made up of sheepskin. I'm not talking wool carpet, I'm talking a sheepskin rug. It was a complete pimp's car. It was horrible. Everyone hated it. It went to a motor show, and the press were told at that motor show that the car would be in production in another 12 months. The engineers that I was working with were absolutely horrified. They knew nothing of this. They knew that it was already slipping over, but they had not been consulted. No one had asked them how it was going. They just arbitrarily said, the car will be ready in 12 months. That was 1 year into development. 3 cars built. Now, my memory is a bit dim on this, but I think this grey press car is what happened to the candy floss car. I think it was resprayed, and the reason why I think this is that there was this grey press car that went out for test drives, and if I remember correctly, it did have the interior of the candy floss car in it. It definitely had the semi-aniline leather that was fitted to the candy floss car. So I think this is the candy floss car that was resprayed. But as you can see from the photos of the interior, it had the semi-aniline, that is the semi-aniline leather that scratched if you looked at it. Now, another interesting thing, around the time of the candy floss car, this was the first car that replaced the paint finish on the dashboard and around the gear lever and the door cappings with amaretto and leather, which was after a customer clinic where potential customers said they didn't like the paint finish. Now, this was an additional cost, an additional time, additional development time, but at the end of the day, the interior of the car did look much, much better. And therefore, I think it was the right decision to make. But that, I think, yes, this is the candy floss car as it was after it was resprayed. So I think that's what happened to this car. Chassis 005 and 006 were the cars that eventually were shown to the press as production ready. These cars in reality were actually at the stage where you finalize how everything goes together. You finalize how all the panels are fitted, and you do your set of drawings and instructions and build manual, and you perfect it before it's put into production, which would take another 12 to 24 months. But these two cars were shown to the press as finished production cars. The blue car was the better of the two. Everything seemed to work. And the red car had little niggles. You know, the rotating headlamps would occasionally stick, or something else would stop working. But it was little minor niggles that would be developed out over time. But there was no time. The car had to be there at the motor show, ready for the press to see, and the magazines were driving it. So the magazines that got the blue car, inevitably, the stories were brilliant. And the red car, if there was ever any question of the car being production ready, those were the questions that were in the red car. Noel Edmonds got to drive the red car when it was on the motor show special for Top Gear. Now, some of you may have heard the story about the road crash that proved how strong this car is. And I'll tell you the true story of that. You see, the company used subcontractors to develop various parts of the car. Now, there was one company that specialised in sound deadening in cars, and there's various types of sound deadening used at different parts of this car to reduce the noise for the occupants. This is one of the things with the leather interior that replaced the paint finish that pushed the price up from the $28,000 that it was originally supposed to be, which was, to be honest, way too cheap for the technical spec of the car, up to the £40,000+ that the original customers ended up paying. But the fact is that it was a £40,000 to £50,000 car when it left the factory, in terms of its spec and the quality of components that were used. It was just criminally underquoted at the beginning. Anyhow, the crashed car. What happened was, when one of these subcontractors had the car, and they were supposed to be driving it moderately in order to test where the noises were coming from, so they could identify different sound deadening materials that could be used. Driving the car was legitimate. Stories came back that a truck was on its way containing the battered remains of a Panther Solo. What had happened was that the car had been driven quite quickly on a country road. It had gone into a ditch, flipped over a hedge, done a few more barrel rolls, and landed on its wheels. The centre tub was so strong that the doors opened without any problems whatsoever, and the occupants got out without a scratch. Now, on this legitimate test drive, it turned out that the accident happened about 8:30 in the evening. There was a young chap driving with a young lady in the passenger seat, and strewn around the car, and some of them were still in the car when it came back to the factory, were the clothes that presumably had just come back from the laundrette at the time of this test drive. Now, I was very, very, very lucky. A wonderful engineer at Panther Cars called Peter Casti spotted me on the production line, noticed something about me, and I ended up, by several moves, ending up in the trim shop where I was being trained up as a car upholsterer. Most of the work that the trim shop did was on the Solo 2. So therefore, I was in a small team of 12 people who were there working on the Solo 2 throughout the development stage. I worked closely with the engineers, and being the young, inexperienced spare pair of hands, I was the guy that could be spared to help when a body panel needed fitting, when a wing needed fitting, when doors needed fitting. So I got more involved with the Solo 2 than most other people. I also worked very, very closely with a select group of brilliant guys, Peter Casti, Gordon Addy, and just to name two, but there were so many really good people. I'm going to put a name call at the end of this video, and the people who were there will know who they are, but they've all had a big influence on my career, on my life, and the Solo 2 has always been a very, very personal story to me, because I was involved so deeply within the car purely by being at the right place at the right time. And the true story of what happened has never really been told. Had that car been a basic mid-engined V8 two-wheel drive car with a multi-frame chassis, it probably could have been put into production earlier, much quicker, and it could have possibly been the £28,000 sub Esprit bargain supercar that it was originally sold as, or sold to the press as. But by the time they'd decided to use the four-wheel drive running gear and that extremely high-tech Kevlar and aluminium honeycomb centre section, it was going to be always a more expensive car. It should have been a £40,000 car from the start. It shouldn't have been announced with 1 year to go when it was at 001 as just a styling book. And customer deposits should not have been taken until the point that the cars were actually put into production, because at the end of the day it wasn't ready. It needed another 2 years of production, development, and SSangYong had the pockets deep enough to do that. It's a missed opportunity, this car. This car here is one of the original 12 cars delivered to customers, and this is owned by the original client who bought the car and collected it from the factory. And we have to thank Leavenhalls Classic and Prestige. I'll leave their details in the description below, because this very car has had one owner from the factory. He bought the car from the factory and is now for sale for the first time. And it is the first time that I've had a chance to see a Solo since 1990, when I left the company, when the first customer car was being built. So thank you to Doug from Leavenhalls, and thank you greatly to both the owner and the owner's son, who took me out for a ride in the car, which is the first time since I was at the factory. And we'll bring you that ride later on in the video towards the end. But I'm sure you'll agree, it's a lovely car. It could have been so much more. It's a nearly thing, but it's great to see that at least one of them is on the road. And if you're quick and you put in a bid that, let's just face it, this is a very rare car, then you could buy this car. But thank you again to the owner and to Leavenhalls, and enjoy the ride. So what footage have you got with the car?
What, sorry?
Have you got any video footage with the car, or?
I've got a little bit. Nothing very interesting.
So this will all be new stuff then?
Yes. Yeah. We're hoping to take it around the Nürburgring at some point.
If you do, put a GoPro in.
Okay.
Or even contact me, I'll give you some mounts.
Lovely. Okay.
I would definitely like to have that in car footage.
Definitely, definitely.
All the Westfields are out. That's the third one today. But it's the solidity, you can feel it inside, can't you? You can feel the chassis not flexing or...
It's just raw, it's brilliant.
You like it a bit, don't you?
Too much, I think.
Trust me, this is more than a car. This is more than a car. Forget about the rarity, just the way it drives. There is nothing like this.
I don't see the point in having something like this and not enjoying it.
Absolutely.
You have to
You've
enjoy
got
it.
to. That's what used to upset us. That most of the cars were going to end up in a collection. As a guy on a production line, you want the car that you work on to be used and enjoyed.
Definitely.
There is absolutely no point to a car like this sitting in a box. You know, you might as well buy a Corgi if that's all you're going to do. So do you have your own collection or?
Nothing very interesting. I've had a few Mercedes E63s, C63s, R8s. I've got nothing now.
I always go for the obscure.
Yeah. Do you have anything nice?
My father's got a Scimitar, which I've got a leather interior for, which we're trying to get back on the road.
Yeah.
And I've got a Quantum Saloon, very rare, about 215 were built. I've got one 193. The other thing about these is the ride. It's just got such a good ride, given the performance as well.
Definitely.
Engineer at Panther took me out for a run just before I left the company to make sure I'd experienced it.
That was very kind of him.
It was. I'll never forget him. I owe him everything.
So were you at Panther for long or?
3 years.
Okay.
Basically, the entire development period for the Solo 2, I was there.
Right.
Not as anyone important. I was the spare guy that was handy when they needed to fit body panels and things like that to the prototypes.
Okay.
So I've trimmed a few of these and fitted a few and helped with the headlining, and you know, there's lots of jobs here I recognise.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like with all cars of that kind, you do your best work and someone drives off in it.
That's it.
But yeah, I've trimmed a load of these.
So are you aware of how many there actually are?
I know how many they say they built. They say they built 12.
Yeah.
I'm very sceptical. There is 6 prototypes. I left in 1990 and the second production car was just underway. So it is possible they built 12 in the year that remained before they closed the company. So 12 is possible, Thank you for watching the video. Please click on the thumbs up for like and click on the bell to subscribe. And to show the power of the internet, let's do a little experiment. Why don't each of you that are watching this, if you've enjoyed the video, hit that bell. See the difference in the power of YouTube, and you can make a big difference to the channel. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye. I'll tell you the chassis story. Come by the camera. Right, so we got suspicious that they were going to move production to Korea when a gang of about 100 Koreans turned up in the factory all of a sudden. We issued a section over there, just over there, of the factory floor space that was eventually supposed to be for production. Right, so these guys were given brand new welding gear, and the backbone chassis that underpins the whole thing front to rear, that's all laser cut and jigged,
Yeah.
so you can't possibly get it wrong, right? All the louvers put in it, all the panels laser cut, perfect, right? So our guys, the engineers, showed them how to assemble one chassis in the jig. This, and this. There's your new welding masks. Hold the welding mask whilst I'm welding, please. Right, perfect. Fits the jig. Perfect. Everything's perfect. That's a chassis. Oh yeah, we can do that. You sure? Yeah. Do you want us to show you? No, we know what we're doing. You sure? Yeah, we know what we're doing. So, they put up these big screens around the area, which made us suspicious. And then they wouldn't let anyone behind the screen. Eventually, one of our guys just got so curious, we just had to have a look behind the screen and see what these guys were up to. What they did was, there was a big pile of brand new welding masks sat on the floor, and there were Koreans lining up the weld like that, turning away like that. That's how they were welding the chassis. Now none of these went to production, okay? So after a while they declared that they'd finished. The screens came down, the engineers went to have a look. Their chassis somehow was an inch out from the jig, but that doesn't matter. It's okay because they put a little block in the jig so that it met their chassis. It took our guys 6 months dismantling that to try and work out how you manage to make a laser cut jig mounted chassis 1 inch different, but they did. That is genius.